Hello, I'm Morgan Pehme with City and State, and if you hear phones ringing in the background, that's because we're at the site of a dramatic location, NYPIRG and Common Cause New York's voter helpline, and we're here with Neal Rosenstein, NYPIRG's government reform coordinator. Neal, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, a real pleasure.
So we hear the phones ringing. Does that mean that there's been a lot of problems with voting today?
Yeah, I mean, we've got well over 200 calls as of an hour or so ago, which for an off-election year like this is pretty troubling. A lot of our calls aren't voters just looking for their poll site or basic information, but have had a real problem at the polls.
Is the main problem been the lever machines?
Yeah, about half of the specific complaint calls we've gotten so far today have been about lever machines. I would say the vast majority of those have actually come from Brooklyn. So Brooklyn seems to be leading the pack, so to speak, with broken machines. Staten Island, we didn't have a report of a single broken machine. Of course, they may be out there. It just means folks haven't called us about them.
And how many total complaints have you had so far? And you know, it's about 130 right now.
Yeah, it was about an hour ago. We had about 200 calls logged in, about 75 or so specific complaints that rise to the level of something beyond like where do I vote? About half of those, or at least half of those, were problems with voting machines. And one of the troubling things is when we get calls like that late in the day. Early in the morning, these machines haven't been used in 4 years. Polling inspectors may not be familiar with them. You have some problems. But they get calls later in the day that those issues haven't been resolved, or that machines are now breaking down after being in service for a while. That's a cause for concern. And it's one of the reasons the civic community and civic groups in the state were united in our opposition for the return of the levers.
And why was that? Is that because the electronic machines are just more dependable than the lever machines?
Well, if you take a look statistically, to begin with, the levers, there are less undervotes. In other words, more people vote on the levers, more people vote on the optical scan than they do on the levers. There are less undervotes on the optical scan systems. Just because of the layout, the balloting, it's a bit confusing. Lever machines are also technically illegal for all federal elections because there's no verifiable audit trail, which this legislation, the federal legislation, HAVA required. The lever machines are also less accessible for voters with disabilities who, let's say someone is in a wheelchair, can't reach the top of the screen. So there was a wide number of the issues. But for us, more people vote on optical scan. We think they're more reliable, and we're looking forward to their return.
So we've heard that even some candidates have had problems today voting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've heard at least 2 reports, the major candidates. Joe Lhota was forced to vote by by emergency ballot when his voting machine was down this morning. And later on in the day, Anthony Weiner went to vote, and there was some type of glitch with the generation of the poll site books. His signature wasn't there with his enrollment. His name was there. So they said, well, you're going to have to vote by affidavit. He said that was ridiculous, and luckily he knows people at the board, and he was able to vote on the machine itself. But not everyone is so lucky to be able to call someone at the board to get to vote on a machine.
Have you heard any particularly horrific anecdotes from frustrated voters today?
Well, listen, first let me say that there's over 35,000 poll workers have to be recruited, over 1,200 poll sites. And the vast majority of poll workers and the majority of sites run smoothly and they run well. That doesn't say we haven't heard about poll inspectors who've been rude, poll inspectors who've been giving people incorrect information. We can verify oftentimes that the information is incorrect because we can look up a voter's record on the databases here in our own office, and yet we know they were at the right site, and the poll worker said, no, you can't vote here, go to some other site or location. So we hear things like that, and that's really troubling. That voter went to another site and voted by affidavit, they would lose their ballot because they were sent to the wrong site.
You know, we've heard some accounts of people being able to vote multiple times, or some candidates not showing up on the ballots on certain machines. I mean, can we still be depend upon the accuracy of the ultimate count today?
Yeah, well, you know, the notions of voter fraud, and we're very concerned about that, and we'd want to hear about them. It's very difficult. If poll workers are doing their job, you've got to sign in, you've got to be...
Oh, I didn't mean intentional voter fraud. I meant just inadvertently. You know, I'm trying to cast my ballot and then I pull the lever twice. I just make a mistake. Can we feel certain that the ultimate count will be close to, accurate?
Yeah, by all means. And I'm sure if those issues raised, there'll be campaigns ready to sue at a moment's notice for a new vote count if the election is close. But while we've heard problems with the machines, It's very, very hard with those levers for years to be able to actually get to vote twice unless a poll inspector is letting you. And that is impossible to stop almost on any vote system. But charges of voter fraud the real voter fraud actually, the voter fraud perpetrated on voters are arcane election laws that say you might have had to have registered or changed your party enrollment over a year ago in order to vote in the upcoming primary election. The fact that we don't have election day registration or automated registration. I think those are the real frauds in the system when we talk about wanting to have a real functioning, working representative democracy.
Based upon the number of complaints that you've received from voters, can you derive any sense of what the turnout has been in the 5 boroughs today?
Yeah, no, that we can't. The call volume we're getting is certainly a lot less. I said as of noon we maybe had logged in about 200 calls. At the presidential elections in the past we might have logged in 800 or close to 1,000 by noon. In a way that almost meshes with expectations. I think there may be a quarter to a fifth, 20% of the folks who voted in a presidential election voting at this election. So if that's any indication, I think the estimates of 700,000 to 800,000 folks casting ballots at the polls today may be pretty accurate.
And if there are still voters out there who want to call the hotline, what's the number?
That's great. It's 212-822-0282. We can help voters with the real easy informational problems. Where's my poll site? Am I registered in a party that's having a primary today? Right? Just because you've always voted for one party doesn't mean you get to vote in their primary. You've got to be registered in that party. And that's a common mistake that voters make, not poll workers. And we're also very interested to hear about problems with machines, and all of those we report immediately to the Board of Elections to make sure they're resolved. But it's very useful for the civic community and groups like ours. The hotline is run by, co-sponsored by Common Cause New York, to have a pulse on the kind of problems they are for our advocacy efforts for working for a better voting system for the future.
Neal Rosenstein of NYPIRG, thank you so much for joining us.
Morgan, a pleasure.